we are going to make a simple 2D zombie AI in Unity, and we're going to use the state machine behavior to implement the AI of our enemy. As you can see, for now he's idle because we are far away from him, and if I go close a bit he will start chasing, and if we are too close he starts attacking. So it's very easy to implement this kind of AI using the animator component. You only need to know a bit about the animations and how to transition between different states. And if he reaches the edges, you see he stops and goes back to the idle state. But if we go to the other side, he will start chasing again. Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the bell icon. I appreciate that. So here we have our 2D platformer game. So first of all, we need to download the sprites of our enemy, and I'm using the Game Art 2D website. The link is under the video description. Then you need to select the freebies section. Under here we have some free sprites. In this video we're gonna use the enemy or the zombie character. We have all of the animations that we need, like idle, walk, attack. So let's download it using this free download button. Then we need to extract the files, and we will have this PNG folder where we have our enemies. We have a male version and a female one. Let's import our files, but first I'm gonna rename the folder to zombie, and let's import it into Unity. And once it gets imported, we're gonna start by creating the idle animation. So by default the enemy is in an idle state. Here you could use the female version or the male one. So let's select the female, select the first idle sprite and shift select the last one. Then let's drag these under the hierarchy, and Unity creates the animation by default. Let's put it under the animation folder and let's create a new one. I'm gonna call it zombie. Then let's give it a name like idle, and that's going to add the enemy in our scene. Let's give it a name like zombie. So I'm gonna change the scale to 0.45 on the X and on the Y. Then let's move it to the left side by changing the X position to -11. Also let's change the order in layer to a bigger number like 5. You see that we have our enemy and he's idle, but we didn't add the logic yet to transition between the different states. And to do that, we are going to use the animator component. So when we've created this zombie character, we have this animator controller that is created by default. Let's give it a name like controller. If you double click on it, you will see this animator window where we have all of these states. Like the idle one, we can change the name to idle state. And before we start writing the code, let's create the other animations. The same thing, you need to drag in these sprites, and in this video we're gonna need the run animation, and it's gonna be the chase state. Let's drag it and let's create the animation under the same folder. I'm gonna call it walk. Then let's hit save, and it's going to add this character as well. We need to get rid of it. We only need the animation, which is walk, and delete this animator controller. Then let's drag the attack sprites. You only need to drag the animation, and let's change the name to chase state. And finally let's drag in the attack animation, and let's call it attack state. Now to switch between these states, we are going to add transitions by right click, make transition from idle state to chase state. And the same thing, we need to go back whenever the player is too far. Now to control these transitions, we add parameters using the plus icon. I'm gonna use a boolean, and let's call it is chasing. Then we can select the transition, and we want to go from the idle state to the chase state. Whenever this boolean is true, we can hit this plus icon and add the condition is chasing true. and we can switch back to the idle state whenever we set the boolean is chasing to false. And basically we're gonna change this parameter from our scripts. But before that, we need to make some changes. For example, let's change the exit time to 1. Also, it's recommended to change the transition duration to 0 if you are working on a 2D game. Then we're gonna uncheck has exit time. The same thing for the other transition. And uncheck the has exit time option. But if I hit play, the enemy is gonna be idle all the time because we didn't add the logic to switch between idle and chase. And to do that, we can add a script to each of these states to check if something is happening. And to do that, we can select the idle state. Then we have this button, add behavior. If you click on it, Unity creates a script. I'm gonna call it idle state as well. Then hit enter and create and add. Also, we can open it up. It is created under the assets. You will see a bunch of comments, but don't worry. We have some methods. We are going to use these 3: the onState enter, onState update, and the onState exit. The onState enter is called once when we enter the state. Then we have the onState update. It's called over and over again when the state is active. That means when the player is idle. And finally, we have the onState exit that is called once we exit the idle state. For example, we can use the onState enter to play some kind of a sound when we enter the idle state. Also, we use the onState enter to initialize some variables and so on. So this script only works when the enemy is in the idle state, and that's very important. So whenever our enemy is idle, we're gonna check for the distance between the zombie and the player. Then if it's less than a certain range, we can switch to the chase state using transform. Then let's call it target equals game object dot find object with tag, and we want to get the player. So let's pass in the player tag dot transform. We can go under the onState update. So each time we are going to calculate the distance using a float, and let's call it distance equals vector2 dot distance, and this is a built-in function that allows us to calculate the distance between two vectors. So let's pass in the player position using target dot position, and the zombie position we can use the animator variable. So this is the animator of the enemy. We can use animator dot transform dot position, and once we calculate the distance, we are going to check if it's less than 10 or less than 7. We're gonna switch to the chase state by changing the boolean is chasing using animator dot set boolean, which is chasing, then true. By default, the zombie character is idle, and if we go close a bit, it starts walking, and we only need to add a chase state script so that we can move the zombie towards the player when he's in the chase state. We are going to select the chase state and add behavior. Let's call it chase state, then new script and create and add. We need to add a target variable. Then let's initialize it. Then we can move the enemy towards the player using vector2 dot move towards. We give it the current enemy position and the target position. Also, we have another parameter which is the speed. So we can add another variable using public so that we can adjust it. Float, and let's call it speed. I'm gonna give it a default value 3. Then we can enter it as a third parameter, and let's multiply it by the time to delta time to make it frame rate independent. But our vector2.move towards function returns a vector2, and it's the new position of the zombie. So we need to actually change the position using animator dot transform dot position equals this vector. and that will actually move the zombie. Now the enemy is chasing, but we have few problems. We need to flip the enemy. Also, we need to fix the Y position. As you can see, he's flying. Let's go back to the script. And here, instead of using the target position, we will only use the X value. So let's cut this parameter and create a vector2. I'm gonna call it a new position or new pose equals new vector2. For the X, I'm gonna use the target X position, but for the Y value, we're gonna leave it the same using animator dot transform dot position dot Y, and that's gonna fix the problem. And let's pass in the new position using a new pose. Then let's save the script, and I'm gonna create another script and attach it to the zombie so that we can flip it when the player is on the left side. And to do that, let's go under the scripts folder, and under the enemy folder, I'm gonna right click, create C# script. I'm gonna call it zombie. Then let's attach it to the zombie character. So under this script, we're gonna check if the player is on the right side. In such case, we're gonna change the zombie scale to a positive value, 0.45. But if the player is on the left side, we can flip the enemy by changing the X scale to minus 0.45. And that's how we can flip it. So let's go back to the script. First, we need to add our player transform. Let's call it target as well. Then we can find it. So make sure that the player has the player tag as well. Dot transform. Then under the update function, we're gonna check if target dot position dot X. So if the X position of the player is greater than the enemy X position, in this case we are going to change the scale of the enemy. In this case we are going to pass in a positive value, 0.45, to flip the enemy to the right side. And don't forget this F because we have floats. Otherwise, we're gonna flip it to the left side by changing the X scale to minus 0.45. And now our enemy is not moving on the Y axis, he's only moving on the X. Also, it is flipped when we are on the left side or on the right side. But whenever we go to the other side, you see that he's moving. Basically, we're going to create an empty game object and use physics.raycast to check if there is something under the feet of the enemy. If it doesn't, we are going to stop him. Let's go back to the enemy, and we're going to create an empty game object on the right side of the enemy using right click, create empty, and let's call it border check. Then let's move it using the move tool on this side. Then let's open up the chase state script. Let's add a reference to the empty game object that we have created using transform border check. You could add a tag to this border check empty game object and use find object with tag. But we have another option. We can add this border check reference under the zombie script using public transform, and let's call it border check as well. Now we can reference it from the inspector because the zombie script is attached to the zombie character. But I forgot to save the script. Now let's drag in the border check, and once you do that, we can access this variable from the chase state using the animator component dot get component, and we can find the zombie component or the zombie script. And because we have declared the variable as public, we can use dot border check, and that's how we can initialize our variables from the chase state script. And once you do that, we can go under the onState update, and let's use if physics2d dot raycast. So this takes a position, and we're gonna use the border check position using border check dot position. And the second parameter is a direction, and we're gonna use vector2 dot down, and that's because we want to look down and check if there is an object. Also, we have a third parameter, which is the maximum distance. We can pass in 2. So this physics.writecast is going to create an invisible line, and if it's hitting an object that has a collider, like the ground, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. So we want to check if this equals false. In such case, we're gonna stop our enemy by switching to the idle state using animator dot set boolean, and it's the boolean is chasing. Let's set it to false to switch back to the idle state. But we will have one problem. Whenever the enemy switches to the idle state, he's going to check if the distance is less than 7. Then he will switch back to the chase state. And to fix that, we can add the same if statement. So if there is nothing under the feet of the enemy, when he's in the ideal state, we need to return. And that will fix the problem. Also, we need to add a reference to the border check. I will just copy these lines of code. Then let's initialize it. Under the onState enter. Let's save our script. If we go to the other side, as you can see, it stops, and that's because we haven't something under the border check empty game object. But if I go to the other side, the enemy goes back to the chase state, so it's working. Now we're gonna add the attack state. When the enemy is too close, we're going to switch to an attack state, and that's very easy now. Let's go back to the animator window, and we need to make a transition to the attack state. So let's go from chase to attack, and also we need to go back if we are far away from the enemy. Then to control these transitions, we need to add another parameter, and let's use a boolean. I'm gonna call it is attacking, and we're gonna switch from chase to attack when is attacking is true. Also make sure to change the exit time to 1, the transition duration to 0, and uncheck has exit time. The same thing for the other one. And let's change the condition. So we need to switch back to the chase state when is attacking is false. And we're gonna change this parameter from the chase state script. So let's open it up. Then under here, we're gonna calculate the distance. And if it's less than 2 units or 1.5, we're gonna switch to the chase state. And to do that, I will just copy these lines of code. So here we are calculating the distance, and let's paste it under the onState update. Each time we need to calculate the distance between the target and the enemy, and if it's less than 1.5, in such case we are going to change the boolean is attacking, and that will switch the enemy from the chase state to the attack state. But also we need to go back, so we're gonna add another script using add behavior, attack state. So under this script, we're gonna check if the distance is greater than 2 units. We're gonna switch back to the chase state and so on. And because I'm a lazy person, I will just copy the lines of code to get the target under the attack state. Then under the onState update, we're gonna calculate the distance and check if it's greater than 2. So let's change the condition, distance greater than 2. Then we need to switch back to the chase state by changing the boolean is attacking to false. Let's save it. And there you go, we have created a simple enemy AI using the state machine behavior. As you can see, he's attacking. Also, if we go to the other side, he goes back to the idle state. You could also play some kind of sound effects. For example, once we exit from the idle state, we can play some kind of scream sound. And to do that, we can use the audio manager. And if you didn't watch my video about the audio manager, make sure to check it out. So here we have some sounds. We can add more using this plus icon. And let's open one of these scripts, like the idle state. So once we exit from the idle state, we can play this sound using audio manager dot instance dot play, and let's pass in the name zombie scream. Let's save the script. We're gonna finish implementing the enemy AI. We're gonna give it some kind of HP, and when the health is less than 0, we have this death animation. So under this script, we're gonna create a new variable, and it's gonna be the health of the enemy using public int, and let's call it enemy HP. I'm gonna give it the default value 100. Then we can create a function that we are going to call whenever we hit the enemy. So let's go all the way down and use public so that we can access it from other scripts. Void. I'm gonna call it take damage. Also, I want to pass in the damage amount using int damage amount. So each time we hit the enemy, we're gonna reduce the enemy HP using minus equals the damage amount. Then we're gonna check if the enemy HP is greater than 0. In such case, we're gonna play the get hit animation. Otherwise, we're gonna play the death animation. And to do that, we can use the if statement. So if the enemy HP is greater than 0, then we're gonna play some kind of hit animation. Otherwise, we're gonna play the death animation. But we haven't created these animations yet. We have the death sprites. We can select all of these and drag them under the hierarchy, and that creates the animation by default. I'm gonna put it under the zombie folder, and let's call it death animation or simply death. Also, we will have this object. We need to get rid of it. We only need the animation that is under the zombie folder, and it's this one. We could also check it out by dragging the zombie character. And let's hit play. So this is our death animation. But the only problem is that we didn't have a get hit animation. Let's go under this folder. Basically, I'm gonna use the first 2 attack animations. And this is gonna be the get hit animation. Let's select these 3, drag them under the hierarchy, and create the animation. Let's call it damage. The same thing, we need to delete this object and the animator controller as well. But to use these animations, we need to open up the animator controller. So let's drag the damage one and the death animation. Basically, our enemy can transition from all of these states to the death or the damage states. That's why I'm gonna make a transition from any state to the damage state using right click, make transition to the damage state. And the same thing, we can play the death animation whenever our enemy is idle, chasing, or attacking using make transition from any state to the death state. Then to control these transitions, we need to add parameters. Under the parameters tab, we have this plus icon. Basically, I'm gonna use a trigger. Let's call the first one damage. And whenever we set this trigger, our enemy will transition from any state to the damage state. And to set that, you need to select the transition. Then from the right side, we can add this condition, which is the damage trigger. Then we have few settings. We need to change few of these, like the transition duration. We need to set it to 0 if you are working on a 2D game. And the same thing, to control this transition, let's add a new trigger. I'm gonna call it death. And don't forget to set the transition duration to 0. Then under conditions, let's use the death trigger. Now we could control these parameters through this script, and to do that we need to add a reference to the animator component, and let's call it animator as well. Then we can set the triggers to play the animations using animator dot set trigger, and this function takes the name of the trigger, which is damage. Make sure to spell it right. And to play the death animation, we can use animator dot set trigger, and the trigger is called death. So whenever we hit our enemy, we can call this function, and to do that we can open up the bullet script. So recently we've added the 2D shooting ability. Under this bullet script, we are checking if the bullet passes through an object using the onTriggerEnter2D. So we could use this function to check if it's the zombie using if collision dot tag. So if the object that we hit has the zombie tag that we're gonna assign to the zombie character, in such case we can call the take damage function using collision dot get component, and we want to get the zombie component or the zombie script, and under this script we have the take damage function. We can call it, but this function takes a damage amount. For example, we can reduce the health by 25 each time we hit the enemy. So under the zombie script we need to reference the animator, which is this one, and the onTriggerEnter2D function will not work if the object doesn't have the collider component. And to fix that we can add this component using add component, and let's use the capture collider 2D. You could also adjust it using this icon. We have these green edges, and I think we didn't assign the zombie tag to this zombie. So under this tag property, let's go ahead and create a new one, and let's call it zombie. Then let's hit save, and we need to assign it to our zombie character, and let's hit play again. Now we can hit our enemy, and we can kill it as well. But as you can see, the animation is looping, so we need to make sure that the death animation is not set to loop. Let's select it, and let's uncheck the loop time, and for the damage animation let's uncheck that as well. Also we need to go back to the idle state, so whenever the zombie takes damage we need to transition to the idle state again. So let's make a transition to the idle state, and here you don't need to set a condition. Also we need to change some settings, like the exit time, make sure it's set to 1 to play the whole animation, and the transition duration to 0. But we still have few problems to fix. For example, we can kill it again. We need to make sure that whenever the enemy is dead, we don't need to check if it's dead again. Also we need to remove the collider, or we can ignore the colliders. So first things first, let's go back to the C# script, the zombie one, and under here, whenever he's dead, we can disable the collider component using get component capture collider dot enabled equals false, and we need to disable the zombie script once the zombie is dead, and that's very easy. We can use this. So this means this script dot enabled equals false. And finally we can ignore the collision between the player and the enemy using a built-in function. So under the start function we can use physics2d dot ignore collision. So this takes two colliders. We need to give it the player collider and the enemy collider, and luckily we've created this target variable, which is our player, using find object with tag player. We can use it to get the collider component using target dot get component, and we can get the collider using collider2d. The same thing for the enemy. We can access the collider using get component, because this script is attached to the enemy, and we could pass in the collider 2D component. And I think that's pretty much it. Let's save the script again and go back into Unity. And also we can chase, and we can kill it as well. So I hope you're still here, because I forgot to add the health bar. And to do that, we can right click, UI, and let's use a canvas. Then we can go under the inspector and change the render mode to world space. If you do that, we can position our canvas. For example, we can put it on top of the enemy. And to do that, I'm gonna drag it under the zombie character. And let's reset the position by changing the X pose and the Y pose to 0. Then let's create a slider using right click, UI, slider. But you notice it's a little bit big. We can change the scale of the canvas. For example, 0.03 by 0.03. Then let's double click on it. And let's move our slider a bit by changing the Y position. I think 100 is okay. Also, we can change some settings like the height and the width. And I think it looks fine. Let's go ahead and change some settings. For example, we don't want to interact with this slider. We can uncheck interactable and change the transition to none. And here I'm going to change the maximum value to 100. And that's because the enemy HP is between 0 and 100. And I'm going to remove the handle. Now we're going to change the value of the slider, or let's rename it to health bar. Basically, we can access this value property to change the value of the slider. Also, I want to change the colors a bit, like the background color. Let's change it to a red color. And the fill color to green color. Then let's go back to the script, and we need to add a reference to the slider. But first, we need to add the namespace Unity Engine .ui so that we can use a slider variable using public slider, that's the type, and let's call it enemy health bar. We're gonna reference that from the inspector. Then we can update its value under the start function using enemy health bar dot value equals the enemy HP. And also, whenever we hit the enemy, we need to update it. Under the take damage function, let's use enemy health bar dot value equals the new enemy HP. And that's all. Let's save our script. Then we need to reference our health bar by dragging the health bar slider. We finished the enemy logic. We can hit it. And also we can chase. And we can kill it as well. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any question or comment, make sure to put it under the comment section down below. And I will see you in the next one.